Hi from Berkeley, California. This is Bruce Perens. It is very smoky here, so sorry if I sound a little hoarse. I'm trying to show 80 slides in less than 45 minutes. This is the first time I've done this presentation. I'm not sure how much of it you'll understand, but let's give it a try. So whatever comes after open source doesn't replace it. It's a new paradigm. Open source will continue as it does today. People would get annoyed if we killed it. The successor I'm thinking about will exist in parallel with open source. It does not meet the definition of open source nor of free software, should never be called either one. It attempts to achieve some goals that open source and free software has failed at. So is it time to evaluate our mission achievement? Well, look at how long ago some of these events were. Richard Stallman's announcement of GNU 37 years ago. The Debian Free Software Guidelines 23 years ago. The Open Source Initiative 22 years ago. So enough time has gone by to evaluate our mission achievement. There's good news and there's bad news. So the good news is open source has taken over the field of software to an astonishing degree. No programmer or user can avoid touching it. There's an astonishingly large body of good open source software. Lots of people get paid to produce open source software. Well, that part's great. We really satisfy large businesses. This is where I start to have a problem. They're big participants in open source development, replacing the consortia that they used to have. But the bad news goes on for a while. The summary is there are a lot of ways in which open source is broken that we've not done anything about in decades except to rationalize about them. Fixing open source isn't the solution. You can't solve the problems without creating a paradigm that works fundamentally differently from open source. There's an impedance mismatch between business and open source that actually drives open source. Open source primarily follows the goals of business because of the power differential. They have the money, they have the power. The result is that open source satisfies business very well, but it fails to achieve any of its other goals. And these are goals that go back 37 years to when Richard Stallman announced free software. It was supposed to be about freedom. It was supposed to be about good for people. But all of the good of open source has never reached the general population. And today, they need it more than ever. Do we really help the general population? They widely use open source, but they mostly don't even know it. And it's often used in the service of their exploitation. For example, they have devices that are mainly based on open source software, that eavesdrop on them, that surveil them, business services that have the function of collecting information about the user, even manipulating them, lying to them. So it's not the general population's fault for not going straight to open source. It's not their fault for not choosing us. It's our fault for not serving their needs. We could be doing much more for people's civil rights than we actually are by giving them software that serves their needs and respects their civil rights as commercial devices and services do not. Today, we only serve a small minority of those people. Don't call them non-technical users, though. They could as likely be genetic engineers. They're differently technical users. Open source has a begging problem. Open source developers write the software that keeps the entire technical world running. For this, anyone else would be highly compensated. But the open source developers are supplicants. They have to beg. So how do they beg? Please give me a job in your exploitive company so that I can be paid for writing open source software. Or please sponsor me on Patreon. You've heard that one before, haven't you? So here's my favorite example of the begging. OpenSSL carries the vast majority of financial transactions, not only the web ones. One guy, Ben, we know him, supported it, and nobody paid him. And then it broke, and the Linux Foundation stepped in after the disaster. That's not the way it should work. Open source and free software have made some people extremely wealthy, but for the most part, not the developers themselves. Freedom and wealth for the general population is a good mission. Freedom and more wealth and power for Jeff Bezos seems sort of pointless as a mission for developers who won't themselves enjoy the same freedom, wealth, and power. We're represented by powerful companies, not ourselves. The Linux Foundation Steering Board, look at the companies on it: GitLab, Google, ATT, Facebook, Samsung, Qualcomm, VMware, Micro Focus, Microsoft, Panasonic, Renaissance, Hitachi, IBM, Facebook again, NEC, Fujitsu, Intel, Comcast, and a former Credit Suisse guy. It's like loggers claiming to represent the trees. Those guys aren't open source developers. The Qualcomm guy is the one that especially bothers me, because when I was the representative of OSI to ETSI, the standards organization, he was there to fight OSI so that ETSI would not have royalty-free standards that would allow open source. That's just one example of the differing interests between the people who run the Linux Foundation and the open source developers. Powerful companies make our policies for us. The Linux Foundation removed the only community member seat from the board when Karen Sandler, the Software Freedom Conservancy director, ran to be elected by the community. They didn't even wait for the vote. The Linux Foundation board contains a company which, in my opinion, was a major infringer of the Linux kernel in their main product for at least a decade, and may still be. And the Linux Foundation policies have been to deter and defund enforcement of open source licenses while educating about compliance. The problem with that is that compliance can never be taken seriously by very many companies without enforcement. One example is the Software Freedom Conservancy was defunded by the Linux Foundation when it participated in Harold Velt's lawsuit against VMware. We have a new problem: API copyrights. The jury in Oracle versus Google found for API copyrights, and no case has overturned that yet. The guidelines that were established long ago with a case called CAI versus Altai said that APIs were not copyrightable. These days, that case is being replaced by other theories in court cases that say that more things are copyrightable, and the result is that API copyrights become real. And they will constrain us from implementing APIs created by proprietary companies, which we previously did with impunity. Imagine not being able to implement a C compiler because the C language was a copyrighted API. Well, that could happen for the next big language to come along. API copyrights actually make GPL style licenses more enforceable, in particular regarding dynamic linking and really any form of software combination. But that's actually not what we wanted. We would rather have the freedom to implement APIs with impunity than the ability to more successfully enforce the GPL. Software patents are still a problem. The patent quality improvements that open source won in the USA in the early 2000s have been reversed. The Open Invention Network, OIN, exists as much to protect the software patenting system from open source driven reform as it does to protect Linux from software patents. Who controls the Open Innovation Network? Its voting members are some of the biggest patent holders in the world: Google, IBM, NEC, Philips, Sony, Toyota, and SUSE doesn't even belong on the list. Their interest is in protecting the patent system that provides them revenue from open source driven reform. It's not our interest. Patent remedies are mostly unavailable to us. We can't afford to build a defensive patent portfolio that isn't owned by the big patent holders. We can't even afford to file patents on our own inventions. OIN is not viable as a defense against non-practicing entities or patent trolls. We can't afford to go to court to defend ourselves against a patent lawsuit. We have to be supplicants and beg companies and law firms. Compliance with open source licensing is a mess. There was no design for compliance in the open source paradigm. As a result, it's expensive to carry out, and it dissuades those commercial users who would try. Consider the compliance tools that those companies use. Well, first, we have tools like WhiteSource that, in my opinion, do half a job. They don't even attempt to recognize snippets of open source programs in other source code. Their marketing says that's a bad idea. So if your programmers have incorporated open source as source code in your product, these tools won't tell you, and you'll infringe without knowing it. Okay, take some of the better tools, Black Duck and Revenera. That used to be called Flexera, and before that, Palamida. They're very expensive, and in my personal experience, they don't handle the challenge of scanning a large product for embedded open source well. It can take an entire year to deploy Black Duck or Revenera on a company's body of software, classifying the software, figuring out where the open source is, dealing with false results before you get to the point where you can regularly scan the software and come up with what's changed. An entire year, and it's very expensive. License violations can't be prosecuted. If you're going to have a license that makes significant requirements, you need to be able to enforce it. That means sue your infringers. If you're not going to do it, just put all of your software in the public domain, because that's going to be the effect anyway. Open source and free software developers can't afford to sue infringers. So our licenses might as well be grants to the public domain. Most open source licenses don't add enough value to offset the combinatorial cost of adding another license to the list. Many approved or candidate licenses are not in the interest of the user or the body of open source developers. They're made to benefit the company that wrote them. And we're going in the wrong direction on that. The current open source initiative board policy is for it to become a comprehensive source of open source licenses. That means to adopt many more licenses than there are today. Whose interest is this in? I could do a whole talk about OSI's problems, but the worst for us are they accept troubling licenses and too many of them, and they want to do that faster and accept more. They have a committee to replace the OSD. That's the DFSG, guys. That's the one that Debian wrote. It's a bad idea to change an excellently working paradigm rather than create a separate new one. Changing open source after 22 years would let a lot of people down and potentially kill the golden goose. So let's make something new instead. After 37 years of doing this, it might be possible for us to learn from what we did and maybe even do better. This is obviously extremely ambitious. It might not succeed, but the worst thing would be not trying. So let's start to set our goals. We can take these failures and problems and set some goals for a successor to open source. Our first goal should be preserve open source, and I have an idea for that. We should also commit, as we develop a post-open source paradigm, to grant open source developers all of its advantages and to support them to continue to allow their software to be used under an open source license. And I'll get to how that works later. So let's implement our goals. Preserve open source is the very first one. The most important requirement here is stability. And to give stability, I am creating a new open source promoter. It's different from OSI. It's called Coherent Open Source. The website is licenseuse.org. They preserve the open source definition in its present form, and it promotes a minimal set of only 3 licenses with special characteristics. The only future change to this will be updates of those 3 licenses. So this is going to have the open source definition in the same way forever, and 3 licenses that are recommended, just the updates of those 3 licenses, no changes in what licenses it recommends. So what are the licenses? They have special characteristics. They're all approved by both the Open Source Initiative and the Free Software Foundation. They're all compatible with each other. Hey, new idea, let's have open source licenses that work with each other. Each has a clause regarding software patenting. Each fits a different business purpose. 2 of them ask a little more of industry than some companies are comfortable with today, because we should push that line. So the Coherent license set, the license set which I would like to see open source developers move to and put their new work under to the most that they can. I mean, obviously a lot of old projects would find it a lot of work to change licenses. So it's Apache 2.0, easiest for proprietary software development because compliance requirements are minimal. LGPL3, share and share alike for a restricted file set, allows combination with proprietary software terms more modern than LGPL2 because lots of things happened in the world between LGPL2 and LGPL3. And finally, the most restrictive of the set is Affero GPL3, the familiar GPL share and share alike for the entire program with a provision regarding software as a service. So Google doesn't get to not share while everyone else does. No proprietary software mixing. And now that we have API copyrights, that's actually probably more true than it used to be. It's really just 2.5 licenses because the LGPL3 and the Affero GPL3 share substantial text. So you're really only learning 2.5 licenses. So evangelism is something that Coherent open source should do. It would evangelize open source developers to use those 3 licenses on new work and migrate to them wherever possible. The long-term effect is going to be to reduce complexity. 3 licenses that work together, much less complex. Make more open source works compatible with each other. Facilitate share and share alike licensing. Make compliance easier. So now we figured out what to do about preserving open source. Let's look at our moving forward goals. And that is create an entirely new paradigm which preserves the goodness of free software and open source while attempting to succeed at some of the things that it's failed in. So the goal is a new paradigm because attempting to fix open source is only going to break it worse by abandoning its present guarantees of freedom and non-discrimination. And that's already in progress. Fully half of the DFSG and OSD rules are prohibitions on discrimination. We should know now more than ever that those should be preserved. Okay, one of the goals for this new concept is no central committee. Okay, form the minimum organization necessary to produce 1 license and 1 operating agreement and to evangelize them. And that's all that will be formed. The operating agreement of this group is enforced by developers working together, not by any central committee. The goal here is minimize self-sustaining bureaucracy. After all this time being involved in free software and open source, I know I don't want to operate an organization. I don't want to administer one. I want to develop software. So I'm not administering this. I'm creating the initial concepts and moving on. Freedom. Well, isn't that a great goal? It's one we've had for 37 years and one we should be doing better than today. Preserve the freedom to have the source code for your software and to use, modify, and redistribute the software for any purpose. At the same time, recognize that the freedom of the general population of human beings is the freedom that we are working for. Differentiate freedom in 0 cost. Free as in freedom and charging for some uses already live together in open source with dual licensing. Companies that don't want to share modifications can pay. That's what dual licensing does. Dual licensing companies usually use a GPL style license and a commercial license of their own creation. We will do it all with 1 license. Fix the impedance mismatch between free and business. Charge for some business use cases, and in turn, make compliance much easier than it is for those businesses today. send one payment processor, one check once a year for all of the post-open source software you use in your business. If you pay, you can combine that software with proprietary software. We're making some money for it. We'll use that to make more free software. Make the accounting easy. It needs to be trivially simple to calculate what should be paid for the use cases we charge for. You should be able to run simple software tools, nothing nearly as complicated as Palamid and Black Duck, to detect the packages you use. You should be able to submit simple information on the total revenue of your charged business cases and the size of your company, and you should only have to do this once a year, and it better be a lot easier than filing your taxes. Goal, pay the developers. What a concept. Developers should not be supplicants and have to beg in order to have the right to do their development and feed their families. They should not have to beg to go work for a company so that they can write free software. They should have a means to prosecute infringers and the financial means to represent themselves rather than be represented by industry stand-ins who don't have the same interests as the developers at all. Apportionment is a concept you may have never heard of. It means taking one payment and splitting it up among various payees. So when someone pays for all of their software under a post-open source license, there needs to be a technical way to figure out how to apportion income among the developers. And it's a technical means. It depends on everyone using Git correctly so that work is attributed. There are special cases to watch out for. There are actually companies that make software that does this job today. Apportionment will never be perfect, but it should be good enough. It has to be done by the payment processor, not the business user. There have to be rules against pernicious cases. For example, you go and rewrite a whole product so that you get all the money. No, you have to rewrite it for technical reasons. Serve the general population. Let's start to reach those people who we aren't helping today. Open source developers have in general written software to scratch their own itch. So we mostly write code for coders just like us to use. We've not had any strong incentive to serve the general population of differently technical human beings around us. Obviously, some projects and developers choose to do this anyway. Getting paid might be a good incentive to better meet the needs of the general population. Software that some businesses pay for will always be available to individuals for free and most business use cases for free. Developers will still write what they want to write, but I hope that they'll write more software for the general population of differently technical people. Reduce complexity. That's a really important goal, and you do that by having one license and one operational agreement among the developers. Users only have to concern themselves with the license, not the operational agreement. Compliance is built into the paradigm. Goal. Most people should never need to read a license. The vast majority of individual users and most business users won't ever have to touch it. Why would you have to read a license? You modify or combine the software, you sell it, you offer software as a service, you sell devices, you offer support. Those are the only reasons you would have to read the license. Compliance for the no charge use cases. This is almost all individuals and many business users. Publish all modified source code unless you have a charge use case, in which case you pay instead of publishing. But here we say publish, you don't distribute on request, you don't give the source to the people that you've given to the binary to. The reason is that this closes an exploited GPL loophole. Not one I think is legal, but it is exploited. Easy means of publication are specified in the post open source license. Git sites work. We have a service run by our payment processors that does it. Convey the license and the statement of origin if you redistribute, just as you would today with any open source software. Want to combine proprietary software with our post open source software and keep it private? That's a paid use case. Goal, patent and API copyright free zone. If you or a company in which you have ownership or control, including a separate entity working on your behalf, bring a patent or API copyright suit regarding any software under the post open source license, all of your post open source licenses terminate regardless of what you've paid. We have to do this to keep it an API copyright and patent-free zone. Part of the covenant of the user is that they will not bring that kind of lawsuit. Evangelize. Don't impose project policies. So evangelize, but don't impose good governance and non-discrimination. Because there's no central committee in this scheme, there's no one to judge you. If you violate the operating agreement, other parties to the agreement can get together to sue you. But the idea of having a central entity that decides if your governance is good just sounds a little too intrusive to me. So here's an implementation issue. Use contract law. You may have heard it said that the GPL is a license, not a contract. This is definitely going to be a contract. Users without charged use cases consent passively, the way they do to an open source license today. It's the tear open license paradigm. Users with charged business use cases have to go online and digitally sign. This happens long before they pay. But it says, yeah, we have a charged use case. We understand that we're going to pay at the end of the year or when our fiscal year ends. So what are the charged use cases? Inclusion in a product that produces a revenue payment for its sale or direct use. So those would be embedded devices, software licensed for income, software performed as a service that produces income for the service itself. So if you have a web server, the web server facilitates your business. It's not something that's billed unless you modify the software and put in proprietary modifications. If you perform the web server as the web server, as a service for others, that is something that is billed, that is aimed at software as a service, the Amazon kind of paradigm, AWS kind of paradigm. Inclusion in a product means all components under the post open source license that perform the task, including components in a supporting role such as the operating system, libraries, and database That catches a problem in that dual licensing never worked for those things very well. So it made money for MySQL, for example, but not for uh, a kernel developer. And so obviously, no one's putting a kernel under this without a whole lot of work, but that sort of thing might happen. And those people should be compensated along with everyone else. And then we get to a problem, which is where do you draw the boundaries? Do you draw them in a single hardware device? Do you draw them in a single set of programs that do a particular task? Those are things that I would have to work on with other people and with lawyers. Um, More charged use cases support vended by parties that are not substantially the copyright holders of the supported work. So, in other words, if you are the copyright holder of a program, you're vending your own support that is not charged. You can charge your customers, um, but we would have no right to charge you. Um, However, if you're vending support for other developers under the post open source license, um, you are restricted. You have to share some of the revenue. And the reason that we can restrict support is because our agreement is a contract and you can't exercise any copyright rights at all without joining it. Technically, you can't even read the software without joining this license. That may seem a little of a challenge to you guys because obviously open source free software has always provided the right to read. We provide the right to read too, but you must join the license. There's no choice about that. A specific requirement in this for notification of security information to the developers on a timely basis. And that closes the loophole that we have with Red Hat Enterprise Linux right now, where they charge for support, and if you distribute the support information to others, you lose your Red Hat Enterprise license. And sorry, guys, that's support on my software. I should know when there are security problems in it. Okay, as far as charged use cases, combination with proprietary software, even for internal use. There's a blanket license for the company offered based on its size, paid annually, no other compliance necessary. And if you pay for other use cases, subtract what you pay from this. So it may be zero. It just catches the case of companies that essentially are enabled with the post open source software, don't serve it, don't provide it to others, but it's a major part of their business. You, the developer, should be compensated. Now, this is something I think you'll find interesting, the dual licensing choice clause. Its purpose is to get the open source developers paid along with the post open source developers. So if software under a post open source license alone is combined with software that is licensed under the post open source license and any other license, the license choice for both parts must be the post open source license. And the point there is that if you're an open source developer, you get paid if you also do a license with the post open source license. And it also keeps people who distribute software under the post open source license from making one-off agreements with some customers that potentially create a problem for the other post-open source developers, because now there's a party who's it's no longer in their interest to enforce our license. This is something obviously we need to think about, but I think I have the right direction here. And those are all the charged use cases. Everything else is no charge. All individual use cases are free. Most business use cases are free. If you don't combine with proprietary software, you don't sell the software, you don't offer the software as a service or support for a fee, and you don't make embedded devices, you will never need to read the license. You'll never have to pay anyone. So what are the implications here? Well, a web server under the post-open source license with no proprietary additions that you use to sell products, there's no charge for that. And a web server which performs a service that is paid for is. Okay, so that's often serving the same software, but it can even be a service built using our software, and that is to catch ways that people would say, well, we serve something that does more, not just your software. A hardware product with embedded post-open source software that you sell or rent or otherwise charge for is charged. And the way that this has to be worded, obviously you need lawyers for it. You have to be careful because there are very many ways to collect money from people. We have to make sure that all of the revenue that you get for a product falls under these terms, however you collect it, whether it's a membership or a rental or a lease, or you're charging for the software, you're charging for a service. Avoid circumvention. So circumvention means people make shims so that they can load the GPL software in another product, and they're only using the GPL software from a BSD licensed shim. So they think they don't have to put their product under the GPL. I never thought that was legal. People still do. Very large companies that have made hundreds of millions of dollars in the practice. That sort of circumvention has to be avoided. Another one is dynamic linking, where the user loads the software. You don't distribute the software. If you cause the user to load the software in order to use your device, you pay. So we have to account for the total revenue from the customer, because people are going to have creative means of splitting charges. And we have to catch the various schemes that are currently used to avoid the GPL. So should we be ethical? Should we say, can't use this license for warfare? Well, what about national defense when you're defending yourself against an oppressor? What about wars that are carried out to free an oppressed population? It's not so cut and dry. So there are a number of ethical licenses in this direction. I wrote one. I wrote it as a joke, a test, or sarcasm. I submitted it to the Open Source Initiative under a pseudonym. They took it much more seriously than I expected. I was horrified. But I'm sorry now. And that was the vaccine license. And so I wrote that. If you want to look it up, it's an ethical license that requires that you get your shots. In my opinion, all of the ethical licenses are well intended, but they're feel goods. They wouldn't work in courts. And do ethical licenses do any good? Well, does anyone really think we could have beat Hitler in a copyright court? That's essentially what they're trying out. They are mostly directed toward crimes against humanity, things that, if they are tried at all, are tried in a UN entity. We're not going to be able to address these issues in a copyright court. The ethical licenses attempt to re-implement the body of civil and criminal law in a copyright license. Never been tried, no precedent cases. I'm really dubious that it could ever work. And I have an ethical problem with them. They attempt to circumvent the people who should vote for and enact civil and criminal laws. And that doesn't actually seem so ethical to me. Civil and criminal law voted for by the people and their representatives will always do a better job. Well, why then are people writing ethical licenses? It's because they're frustrated, because they see these crimes happening every day and they can do nothing about them. So I sympathize, but it's not going to work and it's not the right way to do it. Compliance for charged use cases. Okay, so you're doing one of the charged use cases. How do you comply? Once a year, you share a small portion of revenue. Has to be revenue, can never be profit because it's too easy to state your profit creatively so that you never actually make a profit, no matter how much you personally make. I've worked in the film industry. They are experts at this. Very simple scanning process just to recognize what releases of projects you are using. So instead of snippet scanning for open source all over the way through your product, we scan for signal files. Okay, they're related to projects, and we figure out how to pay the projects from that. So you have to provide that information. You figure out a percentage that you pay of your revenue. You fill in a statement. You send the payment to one of our payment processors. There will be more than one. So no monopoly here. That handles apportionment among the developers. Well, why would anyone do this? The fact is, it is more expensive today for them to comply with open source than this would be for many, many of these companies. And at the same time, there are companies that just don't comply. They don't feel like it. And yeah, we should get those guys. And having a process where it's very clear that they have to pay is how you do it. So when you're complying as a charged use case, there is no requirement to distribute source code or the license text if you pay. We publish who has done this so that if you look at these companies and you say, well, these companies are using post-open source software, you can ask, well, is so-and-so paying for the use of post-open source software? Yeah, it says yes here. We probably should not publish what they paid because it's related to what their revenue on a product is and they want to keep that secret. However, there will probably be cases in which the developers get to know that because it relates to how they're paid. There's a requirement in the license that you submit to an audit if required, but there are limits meant to protect you from abusive behavior. What does that audit do? Someone comes in and does the scan for you, with you, and helps you figure out what you really should be paying. And The big deal here really is, is that all of your software? Or is there other software in your company that has a paid use case and is including post open source software that you're not telling us about? That's the main thing we want to find out in an audit. The license says you have to be cooperative and truthful. Um, you don't, you probably never will do this, but if you had to do it, it would not happen very often. It would not take very much of your time. So, what are the fees and the rules? A lot of this isn't determined yet. It's intended to be mostly unchanged after creation. Rules for upgrading the license and the operating agreement, they're not determined. The main intent here is to avoid bureaucracy. A paid or a non-pay user can always stay with an old version of the license forever if they stick with the old version of software that it was applied to. So if you are paying one amount today, you can always pay that amount unless you start to upgrade the post-open source software. So what are the exceptions? Well, a government-accredited nonprofit should be exempted from payment, except that we might want to put limits on some nonprofits with very highly compensated individuals. I know of one open source nonprofit that paid an officer $7 million in a year. I would hate to be in a position to be giving that nonprofit anything for free. The fact is their business is giving everyone else things for free, but that one just stuck in my craw. Compensation of nonprofit officers is sometimes obscenely large and belies the beneficial nature of the nonprofit. Sometimes, I'm sorry to say, nonprofits are scams. They exist mainly to benefit the officers. So what about the operational agreement? This is an agreement that all of the developers have with each other. It provides for them to be paid. It spells out how payments will be apportioned among the developers. It requires that developers are diligent in preserving attribution of work that they incorporate so that other developers are paid. It establishes technical standards for carrying this out. So payment provides for revenue processing companies, has to be more than one, that receive payment and apportion the payment to the developers. It's by tracking who wrote what, much and how much of their code survives into the version used. I have to make a disclaimer at this point. Some of my ideas were inspired by a company called Merico, MERI.co, which produces software that could be used for this purpose. I believe I own insignificant interest in that company, less than 1%. So the whole concept of apportionment isn't perfect, and we need to look at some problem cases. So what are the problem payment cases? Can we score the participation of UI developers as we do other programmers? I don't yet understand the technical issues. Documentation isn't a problem. It's a textual product that can be scored much like software is scored. How do we score architects and project management? Perhaps some role should be paid from the programmer revenue as decided by the individual project. And that would actually take care of the idea of architects and do we want to pay our free support folks, etc. Warranties. Okay, so obviously open source has never been able to provide them. Proprietary software provides them, but most proprietary software warranties are totally worthless. Okay, the main thing that will happen if you try to recover money from one of these warranties is that the company will go bankrupt unless they're a big company like Microsoft, in which case you might have to sue them and they've got lawyers on staff and maybe you don't. Okay? So most warranties, you won't get paid, you can't get paid, they make you feel good, but they're kind of false. um, the only worthwhile warranties are insurance backed, and these are rare. So, the idea of an insurance backed warranty is if one of the warranty cases happens, the insurer pays you. And the insurer is regulated by a state insurance commission that you can go to. You usually go to them rather than the court. Okay, and the insurance companies business is in part paying out these benefits. They are regulated and required to do so. So it's very different from having a warranty with a software company where paying you money isn't their job at all. Okay, so could we provide a means for purchase of insurance backed warranties? Is a revenue sharing deal with insurers that pays the developers legally possible? Will the developers make a deal to support the insurance company in some ways? It's something I'd have to discuss with lawyers. What about enforcement? Any developer who signs the operating agreement can sue on behalf of all developers, but the agreement limits how they sue. You get 90 days to pay after a demand without additional charges. If you are a consistent non-payer, there are treble damages plus legal fees in a lawsuit. Complaints can be let out to law firms on contingency. This works especially well when it's done by a lot of developers together because it means there's enough money there that a lawyer can actually make enough money to bring a lawsuit on the contingent that they'll only recover funds if they win. This is not a moneymaker for the developers, but it lets us have enough enforcement that developers will be paid by their users. Should we have a defensive patent pool? I'm wondering if some portion of the funds collected should be put to the purpose of filing patents originated by the developers, or really anyone, at no expense to them, which will be placed in a protective pool and only enforced defensively. Someone has to decide which ones to pursue and then pursue them. I don't know if we should do this or not. Will anybody go for this plan? Well, it's all for the good of developers, so I think there's a good chance that they will. Whether business users come on board mostly has to do with the size of the community and the quality of their code. Did we really think that business would jump on open source the way they did? No, of course we didn't. We don't know what will happen with this either. We have the power. Developers have the power simply because of our numbers and our productivity. We need to harness that power for the good of the general population and our own good. This will take belief in ourselves to get started, bravery and tenaciousness to build. Where do I go from here? Unfortunately, I'm still begging. I could use sponsorship to continue work on this, and I need legal resources to go forward with it. Thanks very much.